This'll just be...
And welcome to Life Support Live, the weekly live show that explores how Star Trek can help us to boldly go in our own lives to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
Oh, Starship Captain once said, to which another famous Starship Captain once said, although actually like not in the room, it was 100 years apart, hey, wherever our mission takes us, we will try to have a little fun along the way.
Hello, everyone. I am psychologist Dr. Ali Matu.
And I'm Dr. Trek, Larry Nemechek. One of us is a real doctor.
And we'll leave it to you to determine who that might be. On this week's episode of Life Support Live, we are talking about xenophobia. We're talking about a couple of things in particular based on some of the events that happened in the United States this week. And also, once we're kind of launching
some of the events that happen in Star Trek like 100 years from now, or
well, that's what we're going to talk about. Yeah, a specific episode from Star Trek Enterprise. But before we get to all of that, Larry, if this is someone's first time here at Life Support Live, what are we doing here?
I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out for ages. But here's my theory. My theory is that we are truly boldly going through uncertain times. We're looking at Star Trek through a mental health lens, or mental health through a Star Trek lens. And when I say mental health, guys, I don't mean like mental health. Sometimes, yes, but it's just the daily things of life that maybe we can take a step back and look at thanks to Dr. Ali. And meanwhile, while we're doing that, maybe it's a whole new level to look at our Star Trek in front of the camera and especially behind the camera. And that's what I'll try to bring you. But yeah, we have a lot of fun. And best of all, we have this incredible Life Support Live community in the chat. So if you are new to us, jump in, introduce yourself. We will try to see that. And I will especially try to find some new names. But even if you're just an old shoe to us, you are very welcome. And everybody's already sounding off. So if you're new this week, jump in. We're glad you're here. Jump in and make yourself at home.
Yeah, we got a shout out from Jared, who said, sitting at work, giving people vaccines. I miss you all. Thank you, Jared, for the work you're doing and making sure that folks are getting vaccinated.
Hello. Jared, can I just suggest, Jared, that you hold off on the drinking game if you're giving people vaccinations?
Yes. Do not.
Please, yeah.
Do not engage. Yeah. So, Larry, we another tough week in America. There was a mass shooting that happened in this country that particularly targeted people of Asian ancestry, Asian Americans, and an episode of very clear xenophobia. We thought this could be a good launching point for a discussion of xenophobia. We've talked about racism before on Life Support Live,
right.
But a lot of the discrimination that Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have experienced over the last year does feel a bit more like xenophobia. Mm-hmm. And there is a very clear Star Trek episode, a two-parter actually, some might call a series finale, that seems to really explore this issue really well. So this seemed like a great thing for us to talk about today.
But sorry, if you've never watched Enterprise all the way through, or at least this particular two-part episode of Enterprise, spoilers. So even though it's like 16 years old now, coming up on. So you've been duly warned. If you've been putting off Enterprise for some reason, or you thought you were going to age into it after all this time. But I just think after all the brouhaha of the Kurtzman era, maybe Enterprise's debates and controversies are looking a little old hat. So I just want to throw that out there just in case. Otherwise, yes, this is it made me think of, for all the talk we talk about Star Trek and its theme shows and all that. it's there's no room on the bridge for racism, for prejudice, mister, so leave it in your quarters. um, for all that kind of underpinning throughout of all of Star Trek, this was really on the nose. And I something came up this week. We were talking about. I saw this mentioned, the difference between racism and xenophobia. It's like racism is like one particular. What is it? Race is a human construct. We're all one species, and race is that thing somebody thought up to keep us divided, or maybe it was an inherent. Maybe it started with that fear of the other, which to me is what xenophobia is. It's fear of something unlike your exact self in some way, and you dream up, well, there's difference, so there must be something different, and it's like, it's not so much about whether one is better than the other, which is what racism means to me, maybe. But xenophobia is just like, I don't know you at all. I don't want to think about it. And I mean, there's racism involved. You know what I'm saying? I mean, take over here. But it's like,
Yeah.
they are slightly different. And in the case of America's sad situations, people, imported African American slaves over because they were seen as an inferior species and worthy of being dominated, or worthy of that niche in civilization. Whereas it's like nobody wanted, like xenophobia works with Asians because the body type looks even more different than African. I mean, it seems even more alien, and that whole thing of fear of the alien. It's like, well, I can tell if you're just dark. We have a spectrum. I'm getting down the dirt here a little bit, but we have a spectrum of skin color. But you guys are just altogether different.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
you're going to get the really grody kind of perspective on it. And so xenophobia, especially toward, say, Asians, versus racism directed at like Hispanic, Latin American people, Black Americans, it's racism, but it's even more weirdly grounded. I don't know. Am I just badly butchering this here? But this episode totally got at it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, a few things. The episode that we're talking about is Terra Prime, as well as the follow-up episode, which is called
Other way around.
Oh,
Terra
sorry.
Terra Prime is the finale, right?
Terra Prime's the finale.
Demons.
Demons and Terra Prime. These are by the fans and by the cast and crew often considered to be the true finale of Star Trek Enterprise. And when it gets to racism and xenophobia, the way I tend to think about it, Larry, yeah, racism is definitely ideas, belief, practices, systems that might give advantages to one racial group, see one racial group as superior, and discriminate against another group of people. When I think about xenophobia, I think more about otherizing and portraying someone as not being a part of your group, and that they are different, and because of those differences, they're not worthy. And I think there's some similarities here, and there's also some differences. And we'll get into all of that this week. But Demons and Terra Prime, so much about Enterprise, Star Trek Enterprise, is about the journey to that utopian future. And Demons and Terra Prime is sort of like
first steps toward the utopian future.
Yeah, it's a big. We really see Archer and crew grapple with a lot of the xenophobia, the outgroup prejudice that is so familiar to our world right now. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, actually, for anyone who hasn't seen that whole season,
spoil it right now.
Yeah, we'll spoil it right now. If you haven't dabbled with Enterprise, I would say you can probably just go in and watch the last season, and it'll feel quite familiar in terms of the stories and the themes and all of that. But it's definitely worth visiting if you haven't seen it. But this finale, this two-parter, is really good, Larry. I really like this. There
was a lot more scope to me. This is the first time I think I've watched it in ages, but there's a lot more scope to it. I was like, oh, now we're having a Section 31 conversation. Oh, now we're on the moon. Now we're on. I mean, I remember, but to see it unwinding across 2 hours, It's like, oh well, here's even more. Here's the moon. Now here's Mars. We're back on Earth.
Yeah,
You
we've
know.
got our chat section, our community is really firing it all with a full warp core today. So Jason says
We're on all
um,
thrusters.
Jason is defining xenophobia as dislike or prejudice of people from other countries. So that otherizing we're kind of talking about. And then David says racism is superficially based on skin color, xenophobia
Hmm.
is superficially about culture. Both are the same, just claim different reasons for the same kind of hate. And
It's
what
all
happened?
it's almost like to me xenophobia is like I won't even respect you enough to like have a box for my hate for you. It's like xenophobia is just like, ugh, and then it's like, oh, come over here so I can kick you. With I don't know. It's like xenophobia is a step below um, on the hate scale or the just being ugly to people scale systemically and individually. It's like xenophobia is a step below racism. Not that they should be quantified in any way, but um, yeah.
Well,
I don't. Yeah.
they're both used for discrimination, for keeping different groups for maintaining power structures that benefit largely in America, largely white people. And xenophobia was really it's been weaponized at many different points in our history and has very much targeted. There's a long history of xenophobia
Hmm.
targeting
Against
uh,
Asians.
Asian people of Asian ancestry and
Hmm.
Asians specifically, and then later Asian Americans as well. Um, if anyone hasn't really looked into, there's two main parts of our own history that really there's many parts of our history that targeted Asian Americans. I mean, World War II really comes to mind, and the internment of Japanese Americans and a lot of the propaganda that was created to make all people of Japanese ancestry seen as other, and the xenophobia that really applied there. But then you go even earlier in that. There's a history with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that everyone talks about. But if you go even further into history, there's the Page Act of 1875 that the U.S. used to bar the immigration of Chinese women. And the rationale and justification of that was that Chinese women are going to come here and they are going to they're going to be a threat to our institution of marriage, that they're going to create polygamy, that they're prostitutes. And so you see
They're gonna
the long
dragon lady their way in. Yeah.
yeah, there's a long history of U.S. policy that has not only had xenophobia at its roots against Asian people, but has also contributed to a lot of the hypersexualization of Asian women. And here we are, much later in the future, we're still dealing with the remnants of this.
Hmm.
Um, so I think Terra Prime and Demons really gives us a way of understanding some of these issues in a way that might be helpful for us today.
Hey, can I just say something? David Dawson in the chat. I just got to this. David said, My softening of racism is a different thing from xenophobia. Sounds very white perspective. I'm not trying to soften anything. We have a different word for some reason, and I was watching somebody was talking about the differences between xenophobia and just outright racism and why there can be a difference. I'm not trying to soften anything. I'm just trying to get my head around why we have different words and what the different concepts might be. So let me just clear that up right now. I'm
Yeah,
not trying to
yeah,
soften racism at all. I don't know
yeah.
how that came out. Yeah.
I think
Sorry.
um, when we think about racism in America, it's the way these it's the way people are racialized and discrimination against these groups, these made up groups that we have. And while the racial groups might be made up, there's no biological evidence of any type of race. race-based related differences exist because we sort of made up these groups. So
Right.
that's what we're talking about with racism, is how different groups of people are discriminated based on their racial identity. Xenophobia really gets at painting groups of people as other and discriminating against them because of that otherizing that we sort of created. They both have very horrible outcomes, as we've experienced and seen example of time and time again this year.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, I think a lot of this comes around a lot of the renewed violence and attacks against Asian Americans, especially Asian elders. I mean, I'm here
Mm-hmm.
in one of the first big examples of it happened here in my backyard in San Francisco, where there was an attack against an elderly Asian person, and I
Only
think a
one?
lot. Well, there's been many,
Yeah. Yeah.
and a lot of this, I think, this renewed xenophobia against Asian people, I think it's coming from a lot of the rhetoric around the coronavirus, around how politicians have framed the coronavirus. A lot of the rhetoric that President Trump
Manipulate. Yeah.
used, against it. A lot of the racist, xenophobic language that came out of that, and it's stoked a lot of the same, the same thread of xenophobia against Asian people that goes back into the 1800s.
Yeah. Melanie here is making a note too that I mean, there's unfortunately there's lots of ways to fear the other when you're like white colonialists coming in from Europe, and Native Americans suffered a lot of that too. Whether you technically put it down as racism or xenophobia, wherever it's stemming from, it's almost like I said. All I'm trying to say is it's almost like racism is dislike and a putting down of a whole cult. Well, somebody, maybe it was David, mentioned that he thought maybe racism is more about the perception of race, xenophobia is about culture. But I think a lot of xenophobia is about like Asians technically look different than white people. So it's interesting how we've had this semantics uh, thing evolve. But anyway, Melanie's point here was that First Nations, Native Americans have suffered the same kind of otherizing. And especially when we were less, when we were, for better or for worse, when we were less acculturated, and when just Native American cultures were really, really, really distinct, right? Culture, dress, language, all the ways that, just daily life. The 1800s was really more distinct than sadly, a lot of it due to those indoctrination efforts that, what am I trying to say the word? But they tried to basically erase Native American culture and language and schooling and all that, and de-ethnicize anything, which was a reaction to some xenophobic. You with me still? Yeah,
I'm with you. Yeah, I was just
okay.
trying to follow up with the comments. There's a lot
Yeah,
happening
yeah,
here, and
it's a
one
lot.
of the things I want to pick up on here is um, just this idea of otherizing that happens in xenophobia. This fear of people who are not like us, but often what happens through policies and through propaganda and through language that's used, you can sort of turn up the dial on xenophobia, and you can make it seem like these people are more different, like a certain group of people believes different things than you, they dress differently than you, they look differently than you. And again, one of the most apparent examples of this, a lot of folks are talking about George Takei's work in talking about internment, and Melanie mentioned George Takei's Allegiance, which I had the joy of seeing that
Mm,
um, when I lived in New
I
York.
think it's going to be is there a lot is there a live stream or a recorded live stream or it's I thought I saw where it was coming. Maybe somebody's got information. I thought I saw where it was coming to something very accessible.
Oh, that would it would be great. It would be great
Yeah.
if it does, because it's really wonderful. But Allegiance was I forget if he wrote it or if he produced it.
No, he
Larry, do
wrote it.
you know?
He wrote it. He had
He
a co-writer, but no, it's born out of his experience.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Allegiance is his
he's a
Broadway show
yeah.
about his experience with internment and the what happened to the story really follows one family, and if you look at what happened during World War II, this is when xenophobia was so in your face. If you look at the propaganda against Japanese people, you see this caricature of Japanese people, a exaggerating features to make them look so not human and not like us.
Right. Well,
And
look, it was wartime. I mean, I'm not excusing. I'm not excusing me. I'm just giving you some more context here. When all the failures of humanity fall down from one side or two sides, and you wind up with a physical, actual war, which changes nature over the years. Now we have a war. It's could very much be the end of the planet if we're not careful. But when everything else fails and you resort to war, then you're going to have extreme, there's the otherizing of any enemy you have in a war. Nobody loves the enemy. You wouldn't be fighting them. And in the case of like World War II, you had Italians and Germans and Japanese, and caricaturing cruelty, propaganda, to fight the enemy and beat the enemy for the time of the war, going into it and coming out maybe I mean, there's no sympathy for an enemy that you're fighting. So, but in that case, it was especially egregious. Um, I mean, on one hand, I don't want to give anybody a pass. I'm just saying it's understandable if that's who, for whatever
yeah,
reason, you found that way. But in this case, we had Americans who, unfortunately, because of racial, physical, visual characteristics, it's like Germans and Italians could blend in. If you knew a name, you might go grab somebody and suspect them. My family's lived here for 3 generations. Well, we don't care. Well, you could, the Germans and Italians, but Japanese, people of Asian descent stood out. And, the Chinese were victims of the Japanese in World War II. They'd been invaded, the rape of Nanking and all that. And in much the same way after 9/11, like Sikh people were, like anybody who looked brown and maybe vaguely Islamic, in some quarters, and to their credit, I will say this: President Bush at least tried to to stomp that down. But as far as like American representatives of maybe the culture, the Americanized immigrant entail of that culture that might have started a war with us, but that did not happen in World War II. It's like nobody was speaking up for the Japanese Americans, the Nisei and the Aisei, and not only were they not speaking up for the Japanese Americans who had been here several generations, there was a lot of sloppy, idiotic, prejudice taken out against Chinese and any other. The Filipinos that had come over. I mean, we didn't have near as much, and they had excluded immigration in 2 different generations from Asian countries over here. So there hadn't been but there were a lot, especially in California, and that's why that hit so hard, with a lot of sloppy overlap for people that couldn't tell the difference between the different countries and cultures. So on one hand, it was a wartime enemy, but that's still not excuse for what happened to,
and I think
the gross stereotyping and caricaturization and
I
demeaning.
think with both examples you brought up with the Japanese internment and also post 9/11 time here in America, it is a good example of xenophobia and how xenophobia can also become racial based discrimination that is sanctified. So to kind of play that out a little bit, and I've promised folks eventually we're going to get to Star Trek. With with the Japanese internment during World War II, the state-sponsored state-sponsored rounding up of Japanese Americans, American citizens, people who lived here, Americans. Xenophobia was at the heart of that. This idea that these Japanese American people are other, that they might have some allegiances to Japan and the Japanese Empire, this enemy, and if you
And we
read,
couldn't tell, and heaven forbid we look at individuals and look at individual backgrounds. We're just going to take the whole bunch of them. It's almost like the old, what is it? Shoot them all and let God sort it out kind of stupidity. I mean, it's like we'll just box them all up because we haven't got time to look at them as individuals. And the ironic, I was watching a documentary about this the other day. The ironic thing is, like Japan, the Japanese Empire had tried to find allies in the American-Japanese community, like before the war, like the year or two leading up to the war when they had the Pearl Harbor and the war plan going. They couldn't find. I mean, I could be simplifying this, but basically they had tried to find willing, I've still got a heart for the motherland or whatever. They couldn't find. They had nobody. They were finding more American, like whites or whatever, to be. There were one or two Japanese spies here, but they were white people in D.C. and in the military. It was amazing. It's like they couldn't find any Japanese Americans. It's like, so it was like just what the fear was. Just not
so,
that would be different either way, but it was like ironic.
And that's exactly why it's an example of xenophobia. It's there was no evidence, no data for why the U.S. government should be doing anything like this, and they still did. And then you look at post 9/11 time. You mentioned, Larry, after the 9/11 attacks, how much hate-based attacks were happening against Muslim Americans or people that were mistaken for Muslim heritage, like the Sikh people that were attacked and murdered after 9/11. But we also saw a similar state-sponsored programs that were based in xenophobia. There was a lot of FBI surveillance and also not only surveillance but infiltration of Muslim American communities and surveillance of mosques that were happening.
Oh, don't worry. I'm sure some aspect of the Patriot Act made it all okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing, that the Patriot Act in many ways allowed for these xenophobic efforts. That, well, Muslims in America, I don't know, we need to really monitor this group. We need to look at them more closely. It's again this idea that they might be an other, they might not really have allegiance to the United States. So this stuff plays out in many different times, whether it's, are you during the Cold War, a fear of Russians and of Soviets and communism and all of that, or if you look at going all the way back, like I mentioned earlier, the long history of xenophobic policy towards Asians. We've got a lot of examples here, and I'd love to jump into the Star Trek episode, Larry. Let's.
We should do that. Hey, and before we go any further, David, I see you. We're good. It's good. I that threw me a little bit, but I see what you're saying, and we're all good. So, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a lot here we can talk about, and I hope this episode will sort of guide our conversation. So, Larry, can you refresh our memory a little bit about what we're dealing with here with demons and Terra Prime?
Terra Prime, because for a while last night we were all saying terra firma, which is a slightly different generation, a different thing. Yeah, no, it's again the underpinnings of Star Trek. We love to say are all about obviously. To me, the thing about Star Trek, basically, what Gene was saying in a very broadest brush was, it's one thing to have sci-fi and have the excitement of rocket ships and ray guns and gadgets and aliens and all that, but in reality, there comes a time, it's like, why don't we hear from more civilizations? There's a underpinning here that any society or civilization that's gonna be around long enough to be able to develop basically warp drive, to be able to contact other civilizations and other systems, once you get to the technological ability to do that, that takes a long time to develop on your own, unless you unless you have a little alien help bopping by. But on your own, that takes a long time, and a lot of things can happen as a society, civilization, and in our case, like one that's spread over many continents and has competing nation groups, and the people don't all look alike, and so that gives rise to differences and one over the other. And anyway, for all the reasons that some people love to, yes, someone's mentioned divide and conquer, to climb over whatever back, fighting over resources or about ideology or whatever, religion, whatever you call it. And so many, Gene was saying it's one thing to say we're going to get out to the stars and run around and be heroic and adventuresome and scientific and, ooh, this is cool and geeky. But in reality, that's going to take a while. And on the road to get from here to there, there's all kinds of ways. We could blow ourselves up, we could nuke ourselves up, we could poison our planet, we could just kill each other, allegorically, like the Vulcans did, that they built into Spock's backstory. We almost killed ourselves because of our passions and all that. And then, the whole Romulan diaspora, the split there happened, and that explains the Romulan backstory, and they were what they were. But as an allegory, originally that was the Vulcan backstory. But for what it means for us as humans is, we don't get the Star Trek future if we don't figure it out. If we kill ourselves or our planet or both by whatever means, that's typical. That may be why not every planet that's got some kind of an intelligent life form, is talking to each other, because very few get that far. But if we can get that far, we have it in us to do that. It's just that, by example, if we're having these adventures 300 years from now, the assumption must be that we conquered all this. And the beauty of early Star Trek was they didn't talk about it. It was just inferred and implied. And I love the people now that say, well, Star Trek's not political. It's like, yes, it's there. They didn't. And in a commercial, 1960s commercial, we did some Trek Files episodes about this. If you actually go back and look at the writer's guide in the Bibles of early Star Trek, nothing says, oh, and by the way, we've conquered prejudice and fear and hate. It's not. But if you watch the show for any length of time, it's like, oh, well, look at this. And yeah, you do have Kirk say, hey, there's no room for prejudice on my room, mister. Leave it in your quarters. It's implied, but for them to have that world, it has to be that way. Just the same thing with the economics of it. So,
yeah, and I remember us talking about
obviously
this.
Stated later on, but out of the gate, that was something that that was almost like the code of Star Trek, was that they didn't talk about it. Now, fans would go off and write their clunky fan stories or whatever, maybe, and it's like plastered all over everything. But everybody got it. And then when you had the example of the Vulcans in contrast, the Vulcans would say, well, we did nearly wipe ourselves out, which to a human watching this in the 60s was like, wow, we're all tense right now, and Vulcan actually did go there. It was kind of like, yeah. So anyway, it was.
I remember us talking about this with our racism episode. That was now, I don't know how many episodes back that was. That was a lot of episodes. This is episode. Yeah, today's episode 49. I think it was in the 10s or in the teens. We talked about racism, and I remember mentioning that I've got mixed. I have mixed thoughts about this now. Now looking at it from a 2021 lens, where race as a concept doesn't exist in Star Trek, and it's only really mentioned in human culture, in human society. It's only really mentioned by Cisco in the episode talking about Vix and going back to Vix holodeck and the Vix Holo program, and
right.
Captain
in the
Cisco
1960s.
In the 1960s, and Cisco says to Cassidy, I don't want to go there. Like it's a lie. Like, our people were not welcome in places like that. And then, of course, in Far Beyond the Stars, race is talked about in that context, which is still kind of outside the context of Starfleet's future. So I'm mixed on that, because on the one hand, you can take that as an implication that we've overcome all of this stuff, and race as a concept doesn't exist in the 24th century. And so that could be a great thing, that humanity has sort of overcome this. And it seems like race is not a barrier in Star Trek to, at least not in Starfleet, to what you can do, what rank you can have, what roles you can serve in. That race in this way has ceased to be a barrier, a part of human thinking. On the other hand, you can also see it as this is sort of a blind spot in Star Trek, where it hasn't really commented on the realities of race as it exists right now in humanity. And I think you can see things both ways here. And again, getting back to Enterprise and Demons and Terra Prime, this episode best gets at the idea of how xenophobia does exist right now for humanity. And Larry, if I remember correctly, there's a group on Earth who really sees aliens as corrupting our culture, our way of life, and this is the organization called Terra Prime.
Right.
If I remember
and I know I did send you some images. I don't know if you want to throw any of these up or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Terra Prime is like the nativist prejudicial group. And it's what's interesting about this episode, as I was watching it again, is there had been enough, we're all sitting here, the fan backgroundists among us look at these like factoids to string together, and then once we've got 3 or 4 of them, it's like, 3 points determine a plane. It's like, now that we've got these dots, we can surmise something bigger, right? Now that we've got the individual pieces. And as we've strung to, World War III was something that was not, referred to on the nose. We got bits here and there, and a line here, a line there. And in the beginning of Star Trek, they weren't even going to suppose that there was a World War III. And even the eugenics wars weren't meant, or it was vague about whether the eugenics wars were even World War III or not, or whether there was one. And eventually it got nailed down. And by the time of First Contact, for sure. But this whole thing about the way that Demons and Terra Prime, as I was looking how Manny and Mike and the 4th season writers were stitching this together, were taking all these disparate clues and making something of it, to the point where World War III, so Zephyr Cochrane and the Phoenix, part of the amazing thing about Earth's first warp flight was that it happened so soon after the ravages of a world war. And refreshing this in one interpretation, I don't know how it happened this long, but it went on for, you think with nukes it would be fairly short, but it went on actually aspects over a long time. And one of the amazing stories that still has not been told as a Star Trek drama, like dramatized for film, is that point of recovering from World War III with a few visionaries who may have been capitalized, who were after the money, maybe. But anyway, Cochrane and the warp engine, and then suddenly the turnaround in society, the turnaround in, oh my God, we almost wiped it. The Vulcan-like, oh my God, we almost wiped ourselves out. Let's go outward. Let's get over these, these bits. And Terra Prime and Demons really weave that together, especially in the scene where you've got Paxton watching a tape, which, is like really, he's watching a tape. And one thing this episode did was flesh out Colonel Green. Manny Coto really wanted to do a lot more of it, but you've got an old tape from 2 years after the end of World War III, where Colonel Green, in reacting to the damage, was talking about, recovering from the war, and his otherism was getting going. And then you got Paxton, like almost 100 years later, watching this old clip and finding something that he was terrified about, which was Earth opening up, not just to Vulcans, but to other species, and some people excitedly doing that, where some people, it seems like any step forward, you've got reactionaries not comfortable with that. which is what
Yeah.
hits home today. And in that case, Paxton and the Terra Prime, which had apparently been around long enough for the Manchurian Candidate young kid, the one in the midst, Ensign Massaro. If he'd been that way for several years, if he'd been part of this group for several years, it sounded like Terra Prime had been around for many years. It wasn't just a Paxton thing that he came up with. And if it had been around for a decade or two, this whole thing about Starfleet reaching, I mean, we'd had first contact for 100 years. And there was the official line about the Vulcans holding us back and some humans chafing at that. And that was the drama of Enterprise in the beginning. But then they were moving past that. And T'Pol especially was moving past it. And they'd even help the Vulcans find themselves. They'd even help, reconstruct the original Vulcan movements and uncover some cover-ups that were causing them. There's all this global or interstellar politics going on, but back on Earth, they're stuck 100 years ago worrying about change. And the attack of here's an external thing that had nothing to do with this movement, but the Xindi attack was what they would cite as the wake-up call. But even then, they would go back, Paxton and his bunch would go back 100 years and look at the way the Vulcans kind of, were patriarchy, or being parental about doling out little bits at a time of warp and other technology. So that whole thing of, well, you kept us behind. So it was almost like a little bit of the stab us in the back, kind of the conspiracy theory here of all the things, everything that's egregious mixed in with just things we don't like. And so you've got this one guy who is in a powerful enough position to help spread this toxicity around and grab other people. So there were all the elements of this, including the one guy in the workplace who's kind of down there proselytizing and, rabble rousing the mob, whatever's Green or whatever his name was. Greener, whatever his name was. But it was like that token scene of the guy at the workplace, who's like rabble rousing and getting everybody, riled up. And you've got the one guy, Tucker's in the back going, what is this guy? What? Like, what? But he's weaving it. It's like Voyager conspiracy. He's weaving all these, dots together in a weird way, but it's making sense in the moment, unexamined. Anyway, it was a great episode. And then the reveal, and it's almost like there was too much because some of the things were just coming out like, oh my God. And the final reveal that Paxton has got a chronic illness, a genetic defect, and he's using a treatment that came from the Regilians. It's like the ultimate hypocrisy, but he's got to cover it up because he's got his uber message of humans first, get rid of the other, and we'll be pure, which is very, Nazi Hitlerian there. But at the same time, he's such a, Hitler was actually Austrian, which is German adjacent, but he wasn't even German. It's like here's Paxton taking a cure from an alien culture, and she exposes that. And he's like, well, go ahead. By now, I've got so many people enraptured in what I'm saying, they'll just ignore you, which gets us back to whether you take a vaccine or not, and whether people will go. It's just watching it now with 15 years more texture to it. It's just amazing. But all the little basic building blocks of your standard, hate campaign against another group and trying to exclude the other. Here we think about Star Trek progressing down that alien path, but the fact that there's always reactionaries. There's been other groups too on other groups on other planets. We can talk about that later. But anyway, that's what I loved about in 2 hours. They seem to have all the classic building blocks that we can go back and look in history. There was like a moment for.
There's so many great pieces,
including the worship of the guy that had been like disgraced 100 years ago, but suddenly 100 years later we're going to look at him in new eyes and decide he was right after all.
Phil said the humans in the bar are giving Phlox a hard time. It was very close to reactions after 9/11. And so if you look at, I remember that scene really well, Phil. Yeah. I mean, it's that
was back home, I think, when they first got back.
Yeah, I mean,
right? Yeah.
The experience of Muslim Americans and again people who were targeted as having similar ancestry or connections. So as you said, Sikh Americans as well. It was a very scary time for us post 9/11, and that bar scene does really capture some of the fear. There's many times in my life, Larry, when I've been told to go back to where I came
I was
from.
going to ask you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm saying, you want me to go back to San Jose, California? Like, what do you like? What are you talking about? But that scene captures a lot of that experience, and that's a great example. And the other one I want to mention too, you were kind of talking about purity, which came up, and this is something that often occurs with xenophobia. This idea that other groups are going to um, uh, be impure, they're going to bring problems. Before the coronavirus, we were talking about how much in America. Again, I know we have a global audience, and I want to frame this as this is something that was very much going on in America, but we're talking about refugees as bringing their problems to America.
Yes.
That like these groups of people they just weigh us down. They bring crime. They bring all these problems, which is again all of that rhetoric was framed in
You're going
xenophobia.
to overload
But
our system, our economy. We can't accept that. Yeah. We don't have the
right, and
jobs. We don't have the welfare. Yeah.
a lot of that was happening in other parts of the world as well. So it's that it seems like a long time ago, Larry, but that was not, and we're still dealing with that right now. We're still
Mhm.
dealing with a lot of very xenophobic rhetoric around the refugee crisis we have in the United States, related to what's happening in Latin America. But a lot of this does come back down to that idea of like purity, and whether it's World War II and Hitler, or whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act that I talked about earlier, and the Page Act that presented Asian, and especially Asian women
I
as a threat,
Yeah.
that they are going to in some way corrupt our culture. They are going to make our culture impure, which we see in Terra Prime. We see that as a consistent theme. These aliens are going to take away our independence, our agency, our culture. We're not even going to be humans anymore, Larry. We're all going to be these like half breeds. Humanity is doomed. It's the same crap we
Dogs and
hear.
cats
Oh,
living together.
a Ghostbusters reference. I haven't. I don't
Well,
think we've
to
made
like
many
tie it
Ghostbusters.
down and stick a pin on it, okay. But yeah.
Oh man. This is hard stuff to talk about because it's also um, not only is it hard to have conversations around this, and we're clumsy and it's hard, and sometimes we misspeak, and all of that can bring anxiety around talking about this stuff. But for people who have experienced this and have lived through this and continue to be impacted by this, it can be quite traumatic to have these conversations. I've this week I've had a lot of conversations with Asian American friends who are just so. Someone said, I don't know if my exhaustion is from the pandemic, is from gun violence, is from the racial attacks, the xenophobic attacks. It's from just the intergenerational trauma of all this stuff. Like it can be very hard to have these conversations,
Or the
and this
guilt
is.
that we've all stopped screaming about global warming and climate change.
There's so many reasons right now, right, to be
Mhm.
so exhausted and done with all of this, and this is why we hope that Star Trek can at least give us a lens, a way of connecting, a way of understanding, a way of working through this. Someone mentioned this in the comments, and I'll eventually find out who said it, but it was early on. Someone was talking about Star Trek Picard and how Starfleet gets back to a xenophobic place in
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek Picard. And I know there's some reaction to that about how can we do this? How can we get back to that place? Or you see the
Well,
burn in Star Trek Discovery. Like how can we let things get so bad? Which again reminds me of another DS9 episode. The
what?
great the
Past
great two
tense? What?
past tense. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And which was in the comments too. Yeah.
which
Glenda's
which
talking about
someone
past
mentioned.
tense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Star Trek Picard is a reminder for us. It's a warning that we can easily fall back into xenophobic um, uh, attitudes and practices and policies. And what happens with Starfleet in the future, in the Star Trek Picard era, is the Romulans are very much in a state of disarray,
Mm-hmm.
and how they got to that place, whether Starfleet sees this as a potential political benefit to them, or they honestly just, because of existing xenophobia, they don't want to open their borders to the Romulans. How can we trust them? How can we let them in? They're going to use all of our dilithium. You can't trust a Romulan. Whether it's those attitudes that led Starfleet to not open up their borders. I mean, it's bad enough that this is why Picard resigns from Starfleet. So I think Star Trek Picard is a bit of a warning that this isn't just a Star Trek Enterprise pre-Federation Earth
Mm-hmm.
issue. This is something within us. This in-group out-group bias. This
Well, yeah.
this easy vulnerability to like our group and dislike other people, dislike people who are not in our group. This is something we need a constant vigilance against, because we can always fall back into these traps.
Well, and look at it this way. Not again. I'm trying to be structural here and analytical, not excuse anything. But whether we're talking about real life or we're looking at our Star Trek examples, a lot of times this xenophobia comes out of a stressed society, a stressed situation, and people are downtrodden, and some of them are just trying to get. If people are really under the gun about something, there's been a natural resource shortage, there's been an economic collapse, there's been the aftermath of war and destruction. I mean, look what look after World War One, the rot of Nazism was allowed to grow because the winners of World War One didn't care about the losers, which was Germany and the German debt, the stabbed in the back myth that the German army surrendered because of its officers, and the actual German soldier was just fine, and it was the international Jewish community and the other countries around the world that betrayed us and our own people. Anyway, Hitler played on all of that to get sympathy because they were in like, there was a bad depression, and then the bottom totally fell out because Germany was paying back reparations to other countries. And even though the US and Britain and the worldwide depression was hitting everybody badly, it was like horrible in Germany. And that was the festering place where, like 1933, FDR and Hitler both came to power from very different means. And there was even a coup attempt against FDR. More about, or a plot anyway, the Smedley Butler thing that he helped put down. But the point here is that when societies are stressed and people are hurting, one of the ways people get through their hurt is to try to find scapegoats and find reasons, right? Sometimes the reality is just too complicated or it's too obvious, and they'd rather have a simple. This is when we get into the whole conspiracy theory thing. But people would rather have easy answers, and maybe conspiracy theories are crazy, webs that are spun out. Xenophobia is like, let's just blame everything on this group. Like, let's just keep this simple. I don't have a brain for conspiracy theories. I'm just going to make up a couple of wacky thoughts and blame this group. But out of the Depression, you had that. Out of 9/11, you had that. Here, it was the Xindi. It was people that, even if they're not doing so badly now, like Paxton was well off. He owned this. He was a big corporate. Whatever that looked like pre-replicators taking over. It sounded like there was still some commerce going on here at this time. But he wasn't under stress. He was a well-off guy and had come to these conclusions, and we see that in real life. So anyway, it's just like anytime there's been a group that's the bottom has fallen out of them for them economically, whatever. They've been bombed into non-existence. That you see the Taliban after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and they had a civil society, but it was like bombed back to the Stone Age, and you had an extremist group take over. The Taliban were otherists, but it's around the world. It's not just an American thing. And then in Star Trek, remember the Circle on Bajor that wanted to get rid of Starfleet and
Right.
all aliens? The
Right.
Circle. I mean, it can come out of anywhere. The Bajorans were coming out of Cardassian occupation, and there was a reactionary movement. The Circle. The the Romulans are that way about AI because of the Zhat Vash. But I mean,
Right.
all the Star Trek civilizations have at one time the Cardassians had the true way, right? Um, Gowron had a xenophobic streak when he couldn't believe that the Cardassians might want peace. Turned out it was being spread by a changeling Martok.
And they
Spoilers.
have a whole culture. The whole
Yeah,
the whole changeling
yeah.
culture is
So,
based on
but I mean, so
xenophobia.
it's been it's just as a storytelling device. It's been a sad, useful tool as a storytelling, and a metaphor on humanity, like all good Star Trek. But it's like
Yeah.
it's not just this. Yes, it's not just demons and Terra Prime. If we stop and think about it, everybody's. I mean, you had it in like the Vulcans were suffering. Well, the Vulcans have a little snootiness anyway when they don't watch it, but the whole conflict between the Vulcans being manipulated by Romulan interference against themselves, right? And the Cyranites and the original pure thinkers behind Sarek's original teachings that had been banished to the desert, right?
Yeah.
Right? Am I right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, it's
No,
like
you're
it's a
right.
theme that pops up all over the place in Star Trek, but Terra Prime hits home to us because we're watching. It's like we're watching a replay of all the worst aspects of the 20th and 21st century are
It,
being played
it's
out.
it seems the closest to us now. It's the closest to us now in terms of our culture and where we're at. But David said a little bit earlier that Trek is best when it holds up a mirror to our real life, and Picard made a lot of people uncomfortable. I think because of what it reflected back to us about where we've been lately. Picard was really reflecting back a lot of the discrimination and xenophobia against
Mm-hmm.
refugees and a desire to close up those borders and to not help other people who might be in a dire state for a variety of reasons. And I also want to give credit. I do think it was Tim. Thank you, Tim, who made that reference to Starfleet regressing back. And these are things that we need to constantly be on guard for. And these are things that we can constantly fall back into these patterns. Yeah, Larry, all those examples you gave, like when you actually lay them all out, this is a constant theme we keep running into. And this is, I think, if we ever see an example of first contact in our own life with an alien species, this is going to be one of the biggest problems to overcome. Is many of us will not see them as like us, and
Well,
we only have to look
depending
at
on
our
how it
own history.
actually plays out, I don't know that we'll actually get Vulcans in real life.
I don't
But
think we'll get Vulcans. They're not gonna look almost like us, except the ears and the haircut.
yeah,
Although the haircut, depending on where you're coming from, you
Great,
only have
what?
to look at
How
you only have to
strange.
look at our own examples of first contact between cultures
Hmm.
in on Earth.
Not really
They
enlightened.
haven't gone well.
Yeah.
They typically do not go well, and it is not only is it the challenge of communication and language, but especially if you look at the American history here, and you
Mm.
mentioned Native American and the encounters were usually one in which
Who was really
um,
spreading the disease there? Yeah, right.
yeah, the colonists who came over typically did not see um, the Native American populations as being equal, and horrific events
Even
continued.
when
I
they
mean,
spare them from starvation. Yes.
the seeds of the Trail of Tears and the genocide against the native people of America really started with those episodes of First Contact here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is a big problem, and there was a lot of folks that were mentioning Voyager episodes actually, where there was a lot of xenophobia targeting
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
targeting Voyager.
yeah, like the oh, I've gone blank on them, but the ones that targeted telepath. It's like when there's a fear. Some of these things stem out of irrational, like the first time you hear about something. Oh, the who was it? Oh God, somebody's gonna know it. Somebody's probably already said it. But yeah, the culture that was fearful, and they were otherwise fairly sane, a little fascist, but they were fairly sane until it came to telepaths, and then they were like
Right.
manic.
Right.
I was going to say sometimes when I was talking about a society or a culture being stressed or being, basically being blown up, like the bottom's falling out, and they're under stress. And sometimes, sadly, like people in their discouragement, they're trying to scrabble and survive. And so it's like if they have 1/10 of a brain left over to get through basic survival, they want to know why this is happening, or who do we blame for this, or whatever. And sometimes it's naturally arises, and I'm going to say sometimes it's some smart, cagey mirror universe Daffy Duck walks in to figure out how they can gain from. They don't have to introduce divide and conquer. There's something already there to divide people over. They just walk in and they whip it up, they weaponize it.
Yeah.
And they make something. They make somebody's just. It's bad enough that there's a group that's discouraged, that's downtrodden, but to walk in and then take that for your own engine of power, to weaponize that and whip people up in a frenzy and use their energy, their negative energy that you've helped create, to further your own ends over them or over anybody else. That's it's
I'm
like
glad you mentioned that, Larry. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's something I wanted to emphasize here.
I mean, Paxton seemed almost internally driven, and knowing that he was not, if not dying, at least he was afflicted. He almost seemed like the martyr suicide guy here.
Yeah, Scott said xenophobia can definitely be the result of a stress culture looking for a convenient scapegoat. It's easier to blame the other people instead of looking hard at your own economic and racial system. Yeah, you were talking about absolutely the economic pressures on Germany post World War I resulted in a lot of Hitler taking advantage of that.
Yeah,
and
a lot of anger,
pointing at these other groups, at Jewish people, in
the international Jewish bankers who are holding us down.
They were the cause. They were the cause of this, and this is a classic totalitarian tactic to coalesce all of the anger, frustrations that a society has, and give them all a common enemy. And I am the one who will defeat this enemy. Again, we saw this with the previous administration here in the United States, and targeting different groups and painting them as un-American. This is a classic
the ultimate wag
move.
the dog.
Yeah, Larry,
I'm in trouble, so I'll cause a distraction over here and get us all focused on that. And if I can channel everybody's whatever, the upside of that, the worst case of that is it's not just a distraction, it's like a really weaponized, hate-filled distraction. I mean,
yeah, and this is really weaponizing a very basic element of our psychology. I've mentioned it in previous episodes, but the in-group out-group bias. We always like our own group, even when scientists have randomly assigned people to different groups and told them, I am randomly placing you in these different groups, and those groups then have to work together. People like their groups better just because they're in them. And this very basic thing,
I'm laughing,
whether it's Star Trek, Star Wars, sci-fi, fantasy, America, Mexico, or whatever, San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's, like whatever groups you align with.
Yankees, Red Sox. Yes.
Yankees, Red Sox. Yeah, it's this is a very basic thing in our psychology. And sometimes it can be used for fun, like the Yankee Red Sox, and sometimes it can be weaponized for hate, like we saw with World War II, both in the United States and also in Germany and in other places. So this is I think constant vigilance is one of the things to remember here, because it comes up again and again in Star Trek, and it comes up again and again in our own real lives. And so there's a few things we need to look out for, which maybe it's a good time, Larry, for us to jump into the counselor's log.
Maybe we should, move along. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know you've got a big K3 for us today that we want to make sure we have the time for.
I can clip through it, but yeah, we'll look at
Yeah, so the counselor's log, this is the part of the show where I dive a little bit deeper into what we're talking about here today. And I just want to
structure, guys, for you.
Yeah. We do have a structure. And I just want to thank everyone. We should just Jason apparently is a Red Sox fan. Jason, I'm nowhere in this fight.
No dog in that hunt. Yeah.
No, I have none. When it comes to sports, the only thing I ever followed was football when I was young, and I'm a 49ers fan, and that's about it. I got no dog in this. What's the expression, Larry? No dog
in this hunt. Yeah.
No dog in this hunt. Yeah. I just want, as my shirt says, I just want us all to be kind. I just want us all to be a little idic.
You mean not just rewind? You mean okay?
Boy, I mean, that's not that old of a reference. I guess people might remember that.
I've seen it.
Rewind.
Yeah.
So, I just want to thank everyone in the comments section for people have been sharing a lot about their own experiences, what their families have gone through, what they've gone through. I know these kind of conversations are hard to have. They're emotional ones. They're clunky ones. But I think the clunkiness, difficulty is important and worth it, because we need to be having these conversations. And just thank you to Charlotte. This is a shirt from Chase's anti-bullying campaign. From time to time, I've done a little bit of work with Chase with the Pop Culture Hero Coalition, which I think it says on the back of the shirt. Yeah, there it is. Maybe you can see that.
Oh, see, it's a whole. Thank you for that, because I'm having a whole thing right now about designing T-shirts. But anyway, and when to do it and not to do it.
Yeah, if anyone's interested, check out Pop Culture Hero Coalition. That's Chase Masterson's organization.
Began as purely anti-bullying, but now they've spread their wings a little more to include things like we're talking here: racism, xenophobic, and
Chase played
because they're school focused. They're looking at getting to kids young.
Chase played Lita in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and has been is just a real lovely, fantastic person who is trying to make the world a kinder, more peaceful place. So yeah, please check out her work. She's really wonderful, a wonderful person. So thank you for this conversation, and we know it's hard. We know it's hard to have this conversation. It's clunky, but I'm glad we're having it. I guarantee we're gonna have a very different episode next week. Next week's our 50th episode, Larry.
The clunkier it is. Wait, what? Next week is our 50th.
It is.
Why was I not told of this?
I faxed you a memo. I didn't fax you a memo. I transported a pad to you. Okay. You should. I know you got a lot of pads in front of you.
A whole stack of pads. Yeah. That's how busy I am.
All right, so I got something I wanted to say about this. So the thing I wanted to talk about here is for us to be a little bit more. I mentioned being constantly vigilant against xenophobia, and one of the things I always am looking out for is dehumanization. This is one of those things. Whenever we paint another group as less than us, it's one more step towards xenophobia. And the most extreme example of this is, or I should say, the most emotional in your face example of this is wartime propaganda. You can see caricatures that you can see this both of Japanese people during World War II, both of Japanese people but also German people, were really presented in propaganda as less human, as a threat, as a villain. It's almost cartoonish, and it's important to see that because it's not like wartime's over and all those attitudes go away. No, it's like there was a coordinated effort to paint certain people as being less than human. And the reason that happens is whenever we do that, whenever we dehumanize a group of people, it becomes very easier to ignore their plight, to justify violence against them, to create policies that discriminate against those people. And while it's very obvious with things like World War II and World War II propaganda, it's less obvious in modern day. So if we look at the last year, Larry, if we look at the pandemic, whether or not someone was calling this the coronavirus epidemic or COVID-19, which are largely more neutral words, we had a president in the United States who was calling it the Wuhan virus, the China virus. And those are very subtle ways that take us more towards xenophobia. And there are other politicians in the United States that were saying more xenophobic things. And these attitudes, again, it's weaponizing this thing that's inside of us, the in-group, out-group bias, that makes it so much easier for people to discriminate, attack, kill people who might be the target of that xenophobia. So the counselor's log today it's very, very simple, because I think this is something I want us all to always be vigilant against, is language, images, ideas that might be dehumanizing a group, making a group appear to be less than you, and racism does this too. I'm a psychologist, and in the 1900s and early 20th century, there was a lot of what's called scientific racism, which was psychology trying to prove that there was real differences behind intelligence, behind different racial groups.
Like measuring skull sizes and brain capacity.
Oh, phrenology. So that's phrenology, which happened even before, which was doing the same thing. Larry, the research on that stuff was so stupid. There was a certain set of studies that found that white people have faster reaction times on these intelligence tests that were already culturally biased, and that was like evidence that white people are more intelligent because they're reacting smarter. But then a few years later, there was research that came out that showed, well, white people on this other test have slower reaction times. And then the explanation for that is, well, white people are more methodical in their thinking. They're not as impulsive. So it's like this is the ridiculousness that that my field had a lot of inherent racism. And this is something we always need to be on guard against, is any time we are making one group seem less than because of our language, because of our policies, because of our propaganda, that gets us on the course for Terra Prime. That gets us on the course for excluding Romulan refugees. That takes us away from those Federation ideals, the idea of IDIC, all the things that we love about Star Trek so much. So it's a very simple counselor's log, but I hope people are always on the lookout for what are we saying or doing that might be dehumanizing one group.
And so much stuff is done. I mean, I'm still kind of reeling from the idea that the word that gypsies and that term about I'm going to gyp you, don't gyp me on this or whatever, is a racist term about the
Yes.
Romans. And it's like, I'm sorry, this was all ancient history. I'm like, so do we have to like rename the musical Gypsy and Gypsy Rose Lee? Does she have to change her name after she's been? I don't know. It's part of that thing about if there's no if there's no malice in their heart, can there be any in your words when you were like ignorant? But there is a certain thing to passing along. Or at what point are we 1,000 years out of something that it's no longer hurtful or racist or xenophobic? It's no longer damaging. That's a big question. But I want to go jump back. So I think Kyle Jacobs, maybe a new name in our community today. So hi, Kyle. But he had a point here. He said, has the internet aided in the diminishment of xenophobia with the spread of information, or has that spread helped spread the hate even more? Like people all thought the internet would be the great information boost and equalizer, but it's turned out and I don't know if it's the internet or if it's the social media algorithms that spread the toxicity. I think the basic thing of internet, and you could go look up anything and halfway trust it, or you could at least check the sourcing, was a great boom. And then it took 10, 15, 20 years for people to figure out how to weaponize it and dark side it. And
yeah, it's I think what the internet has shown us is a lot of good, a lot of bad, and a lot of neutral. But one of the lessons is just information alone is not enough to overcome these problems.
Are you saying context is not for kings?
Yeah, I talked more about how to overcome some of these biases in our racism episode, but it's information alone it's not enough. We need extended contact, and we also need policies and structures in place that overcome some of these problems. And the thing about the internet is it can both it can be a force for good, especially in terms of, look, I don't think we would have had the racial reckoning in the United States in 2020 if it wasn't for the internet, if it wasn't for the video of George Floyd's death going viral.
iPhone cameras.
And iPhone cameras. So on the one hand, it has made it easier for communities to connect and for information to flow. At the same time, it's made it easier for communities to connect and information to flow. And we see this with the rise of neo-Nazi groups and the way terrorist groups like ISIS have been able to target people who are alone, isolated, and marginalized, and radicalize them through coordinated propaganda. The internet has both been a wonderful thing and a horrible thing, and it's going to take us a long time to work through some of this stuff. Yeah, I've been reading. Phil says the internet was supposed to make us smarter, but then they let us start writing on it. Phil, I've been reading, let me make sure I get the book right, and by reading I mean audiobooks, because that's the only thing I do nowadays. A World Without Email by Cal Newport. He previously wrote about deep work and all of this sort of stuff. If anyone's really frustrated by email, this is a great book to read, A World Without Email, but he talks a lot about some of the problems we've seen.
I don't care what they say, I won't lay in a world without the internet. Okay, sorry.
Speaking of Larry sharing wonderful things with us, Larry, let's open up the K3 Factor. This is the part of the show where we do some deep dive into canon and stories in front of the camera and behind the scenes that you might not be aware of.
Right. Which is, my thing. It's what my doctorate is in. All things Trekland. And I before I start, I want to say one more yell. I'm staying up with the chat better today. Hey, Nathaniel, thank you. It was I was trying to think of the telepath hating species. I think there was more than one, but the one I'm really thinking about is Kashyyyk. It was the Devore Imperium. It was the episode Counterpoint on Voyager. So there we go. I hate leaving things unbuttoned like that. I have a lot here, so I have this list. So guys and gals, so our theme this week is xenophobia. Terra Prime was the focus episode, And K3, we always, I go backstage. I try to do a deep dive on that end of things because everyone knows or should know, what the episodes themselves, as you could watch on a screen, that. So that's what we do at Trekland is dive deep and bring you more texture. So I was trying to find a real world case of xenophobia backstage in Star Trek at any era, and I know it's there somewhere. People are human, and there's hundreds of people that have worked on Star Trek over the years. Just because I wasn't standing next to a case of that happening, and I'm sure it had to have happened because there's it's LA, and Toronto now. Toronto. No, I'm kidding. There's a diversity of people and a diversity of industry folks, and not everybody's a perfect human. Sorry, Gene. Not everybody's a perfect human in the 20th century or the 21st, and we're not there yet. But I really gave up trying to find. I mean, there's a couple of things that pointed me toward a couple of situations, not as clear cut as either the crap we've been dealing with this last week or the Terra Prime plot. So what I wanted to do this week was really kind of turn this around a little bit, just on its side, and still be in the same realm. There's been so much focus under the guise of xenophobia because what's brought this to the fore is this hate crime rise with the virus, the pandemic against AIPs, or AAPI, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and all Asian, not just East Asia, South Asia, the whole shebang. And I saw this last week, so I've got that big grid picture.
Yes.
I don't know. Are you able to see like when I number them? Are you able to follow that?
Yeah, it really helps, Larry.
Oh, okay, okay. I didn't know if by the time you were doing this those were lost.
No, I'm putting up the image right now.
So I saw somebody else came up with this. There's even a few more faces that other people pointed out here. So here's like the great wall of regulars, one-off guest stars, a ton of great all Asian backgrounded actors, ethnic Asians that have been on a part of the great tapestry of Star Trek's diversity that have won awards over the years. And that's great. And, but my point here is that the camera-facing Asian background, Asian American, and maybe Asian Canadian, I don't know. But all the actors, large roles, small roles, from George forward, that's the easiest part to know. So if you have an order, I want to mention a couple others. Now he says Hawaiian, and I'm not sure quite his lineage, but I know his folks have been around. He's a second or third generation American, but everybody knows Mike Okuda. And it's just hard to think. It's just you hurt. I love Mike. We talk more on internet now, back throwing progressive lobs back at each other now, more than now that we ever got to do. We were under a paycheck, and everybody had to be just put out the Star Trek and don't be political. But everybody loves Mike and Mike and Denise. But Mike's one of the more visible people of Asian descent that have worked on Star Trek. More recently, Justin Lin was a director on Beyond. He has the whole franchise, Fast and Furious and all that. And he's a big name. And again, these are some of the more familiar names. But here's the thing. Let's go on to the next one. So this is a guy that I've never had I hope I can track him down to talk to him sometime. But I always loved his name in the early Next Generations. But one of the alternating first assistant directors for the first couple of years of Next Generation was a gentleman who's still working, Babu Subramanian. And he was there. Then on down, somebody I do know, haven't talked to him in a long time, but this is a bunch of the lower level, this group picture with the surfboard, or the three of them, I think. There's a whole lot of them in the visual effects community, but David Takamura, who's there on one side, has really gone on to have a great career. He kind of came in as an intern with Star Trek in visual effects. He's doing all kinds of incredible things. The next one is a friend of mine. I haven't talked to him in ages, but then I haven't talked to anybody in ages, so I should stop saying that. Alan Kobayashi was one of the great members, one of the very patient members of the art department eventually, who worked on Babylon 5 and worked on movies and things, but he'd been waiting for a slot to open up, and finally, into Voyager and into Enterprise, he got to work on Star Trek. But Alan's a great guy and a great visual artist. This is him at his desk during the Enterprise days, you can tell. Another one, both genders here. This is a great shot of Arlene Fukai, who was a second assistant director I almost put more of her because she goes back to late Next Generation all the way to the end of Enterprise. And she was one there that wasn't 18 years, but she had easily 12 or 13 years in with the show as a second assistant director and a first toward the end, climbing the ladder. So I've run through that litany of folks just to remind us behind the scenes as well as in front of the great rich tradition here that Asian Americans, those of Asian descent, have brought to the industry, much less here just in Star Trek. But there's one here, and some people know this story, and sadly he's no longer with us, but I've got several here. So if you want to, there's a sketch of the tricorder.
A sketch of the tricorder.
It's labeled K361. Because I
have K362. Keep talking, Larry. I'll pull it up.
Okay, there's one that says the original tricorder concept. Please tell me I sent it to you. Because if I didn't, then I'm going to look very foolish. It's not the end of the world. I don't know why I wouldn't, because it was right here.
I don't have the tricorder. But we can all imagine a tricorder.
Yeah. Well, it was the original sketch by the designer of the. Oh, come on here. It's going to be on me, I'm sure. Bang, bang, bang. Did I? I don't think I. Oh, these got. How did these all get? I'm sorry, I'm babbling here. These all got out of order. No, I didn't get it to you. In fact, it looks like there's a couple more I didn't get to you. Oh well. Okay then. No, I sent you the sketch of the original tricorder sketch from 1966 because it has a very big signature at the bottom, Hua Chang. Hua was a Chinese immigrant when he was a young boy, had a mother, family, very talented, amazingly, innately talented artist, designer, creative thinker. So much so, it's like when you see people who had a downtrodden background, it's like they had to be uber talented and uber amazing because somehow they got themselves out of their original life situation and went on. But he's not widely famous. We're trying to make him more so. But basically, there's one you had the big panel of like almost like the actors panel.
I've got.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unless you're a student of Star Trek backgrounding, here's a panel of all the original series pioneering aspects. The communicator, phaser, tricorder, Spock's harp, the lirette. Okay, you got that panel up?
Yes, it's on
okay, guys,
being displayed right now.
All of these things were designed by a man named Hua Chang. Wan Ming Chang, and you never heard of him unless you're really a student of Star Trek background. He was a Chinese immigrant. He worked with George Pal. I've got a picture of he and George Pal winning a 1960 Oscar with their group for the Time
right now.
Yeah, the black and white. That's George Pal, the great director, the stop motion guy. His team that he put together for a few years included Wah there. This was for the Time Machine, when visual effects, special effects were a lot simpler, and they just called it special effects. There's one there of him much older. He died in 2003, I believe. Him and his communicator, or a communicator there, the older one. Yes.
Putting that up right now.
Yeah. The thing was, back in the day in the 60s, he had his own company, he worked with other people. He designed a lot of the monster creature things for the Outer Limits. That's how Bob Justman knew Wah. The point was, if you know your original series lore, the Desilu, and here's Matt Jeffries designing, but they had to be built, and the prop shop at Desilu was just not up to the task. I mean, if Lucy needed a gag something, they could do that, but doing the stuff they needed for Star Trek was just not up to the snuff that Gene and Bob Justman and the group wanted. And Bob knew him, and they had to concoct to get around union rules, and I'm very pro-union, but the system was not going to yield what they needed for Star Trek. And Bob Justman turned around, and they hacked up a thing for Wah to be able to provide them things and not violate any union rules. But all of those things you saw, from the alien costumes to the Romulan helmets to the basic props, the iconic items of Star Trek, are all Wah's. And it wasn't so much that he was Chinese origin it was more the structure, the economic structure. But you'd have to think that systemically, not because of Desilu or Gene or anything or anybody at Star Trek, but over the years, over the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Wall was so talented. He got to use his talents. He got to share an Oscar. But had he not been Chinese, he probably would have been much more able to take his talents out and be known for that. So that he wasn't an enigma today. Still, even though a lot more people now know about him, and we've tried to publicize his story, but still, I bet a lot of people on the live with us today had no idea who Hua Chang was or what he had done.
I've never heard.
Oh,
Larry,
good.
I've never heard his name before, and
Yay.
I'm just putting up that image.
Again, your ignorance has inspired me to keep on. Okay, yay.
This image of I'm putting up this grid again from the Gorn to the tricorder to the very first alien we ever see in the pilot of Star Trek, the pilot with Shatner.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the original series. This grid is the original. It's all the iconic imagery of the original series. The fact that I don't know his name is
yes. All right.
It really on the one hand, it really bums me out that I don't know the name of someone who created so much of the lasting legacy.
Yeah, don't kick yourself too much. Yeah.
No, I know, but and you gotta think that that here Xenophobia and these kind of the more structural stuff at play is why I know about Matt Jeffries, and I don't know about.
Star Trek reached out to him and used him and found a way to use his talent. But the fact that he couldn't be published, they couldn't publicize. And hey, while we're at it, let's talk about the little Chinese ladies that would do all the repairs on costumes and create costumes because their budget was so tiny. And again, because of using studio resources back in the day, that Bill Tice had a little army of little Asian women who would do things, and they would literally get it over the transom. Like, here's a bundle of wardrobe, here's a bundle of laundry, here's a bundle of alterations and repairs. They didn't have even on the Next Gen, the Berman era, there's like 6, 8, 10 wardrobe ladies and a couple of guys. But it's like there was at least an army of them that would sew and repair and do the wash every day. The 60s, they didn't have a budget like that because most shows didn't have to think about, if it wasn't modern day 60s clothing, they were doing a period show and they were renting it and they would just go back and forth with the rental company. But the idea that they had specialty wardrobe, and a lot of how they were able to bust their budget was they were paying pennies to some Asian women, little Chinese, Japanese ladies, to get wardrobe needs done but they had to keep it secret to avoid angering anybody. But on one hand, they were getting by, but on the other hand, there was a system that allowed, there was a black market going on basically in labor. And that's kind of what the situation here with Hua. They didn't invent it. They were trying to use him and reach out. And the last 10, 20 years, we've tried to really publicize once this got known, and it's been growing every day. So yeah, I'm glad to do my little part here today and help further that. Again, the Xenophobia, not about Gene and Bob and Star Trek and Desilu, but about the system of 20, 30 years before that had led him not to be able to, somebody of his talent not to be
and that's what I think is more it has a longer lasting effect is how some of these policies, these attitudes have become part of larger systems that discriminate people. It's not usually as obvious as the tragedy of this week and the mass shooting that largely targeted Asian people, Asian Americans, but and it's not often as
and
obvious.
Even Asian women.
Yeah, and it's not as obvious as Terra Prime, the episode, or as Star Trek Picard. But sometimes it is not knowing who Hua Chang was, and why that might be. So thanks for that, Larry.
And all those people I ran through, the more famous, the lesser famous behind the scenes, some of that's just like who knows who assistant directors are, right? unless you're a
Yeah.
credit watcher. But that was more informative. But Hua Chang, and they're all great people, and we all know Michael Kuda, but yeah, I knew this, but when I found this graphic someone had put together, and I was like, well, this kind of gets the point across. So bang, you're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
Let's get into the away mission here, and this is the part of the show where I give you some example of a skill, a technique, some way for you to apply what we've been talking about to your own life. And I was trying to think of, Larry, what to say that's going to be different than what we talked about in our racism episode. And here I want, I'm thinking more about not necessarily how to overcome these problems, but how to support you and communities who are impacted by all of this. There's been, I was just talking to a psychologist friend of mine this week, and she was telling me that how much the xenophobia, the racism, and the sexism is really coming to light here, and how her experience as an Asian American woman, like throughout her life, she has been called such sexist things just walking down the street, and for anyone who's been experiencing difficulty dealing with all of this, one of the things that's been shown to be really effective in communities that are experiencing community-based trauma, like a lot of Asian Americans are this week, it's to get some connection with communities that you feel safe and supported by. So the away mission for this week is really to find a way to connect with someone else that you feel safe talking to about these things, about what's been going on. And that might mean you want to talk about it. It might mean you want to connect with them and you want to do something that's not talking about it because you just want a bit of a break from all of this stuff. Whatever it is, connecting with communities that you feel you share some identity with and that are going to be supportive, that's one way to get through the traumatic news that we've been experiencing this week. And we hope we gave we created some space for that here. I know everyone's in a different space, and maybe you wanted to talk about these things and think about these things. Maybe you didn't, and maybe if you didn't, you tuned out this week. That's okay. That was part of what Larry and I wanted to do, was just to create a little bit of space to talk about what's been going on in our own community. And yeah, Larry, go ahead.
I did it just to shine some love on Enterprise for doing something right. No, I'm kidding. Enterprise doesn't get a lot of, it's like, oh, and In a Mirror Darkling's great. And that's where the conversation, as the years have gone by, it's like people think better of Enterprise. But I had not watched those intact, maybe since first run. I was especially in the first one, the speech that Paxton gives. I knew the Colonel Green film was so vague and fuzzy, and I made notes the first time I watched it in 2005. But the scene where Paxton is watching an old film of Colonel Green, and I've forgotten that Colonel Green was tied to right after he was tied to World War III and right after, which means it's like 100 years old by the time Paxton's watching it. But to think about how, neo-Nazis are watching films of Hitler right now, and that's been, 80 years ago or 70 years ago. It's like, oh, it's the same thing about how the poison can still find, without context. And when people are allowed, when I was a kid, I'd say, who dropped you on your head, which I know is not very mental health friendly. But it's like when somebody was damaged in their logical, rational thinking, or they've been so hurt by something, traumatized by something, that their thinking process is allowed to process, the poison of that kind of thing. That it was such a metaphor for looking back, and then yet again has so many aspects of. We talk about DS9 being pre 9/11 and being so prescient about talking about civil liberties versus state security and, the other there. But there were a lot of aspects of that Enterprise episode that, even when they weren't being so elegantly, written and portrayed, they were a little on the nose. But how I have to stop and think, well, that was 15 years before the situation we're in now. It was 4 years after 9/11, but before that. Anyway, that was what rose up for me.
Just one more quick thing to mention. Nathaniel's talking about how xenophobia can also merge into misogyny, and this is the whole idea of intersectionality. Maybe you've heard that term, maybe you haven't, but the idea that
you can stand in the middle of two streets in Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and people. Oh, not that kind of intersectionality. Okay,
different stuff, Larry.
Okay.
So this is
Different
more about how.
Okay.
If you're an Asian woman, you can't disconnect the experience of being a woman and also of being Asian American. That these things intersect with each other. I can't disconnect the experience of being South Asian and being a male and identifying as male. Like these things come together, and so. These experiences intersect with each other, and so if we're for equity across genders, with all genders, then we also really need to support anti-racism and how that uniquely plays out against Asian American women. So these things all intersect with each other. So if you want to be for equity across genders, you also have to be for anti-racist attitudes, because all this stuff intersects.
I've heard so many.
It's a big idic.
Yeah, in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 20th Amendment in 1920? No, the women's suffrage equal right to vote amendment was 1920, and we had the centennial last year trying to celebrate, or 1990 anyway, in the middle of the pandemic trying to mark this, wearing the white suffragette outfits.
Yeah.
But watching a lot of black women activists saying, well, that's great, but there were still an awful lot of women who couldn't vote after 1919 because they were all black. The black women weren't getting to vote still. So it was like they were talking about how that was really a staggered situation. I want to let me do one shout out here to somebody maybe new to our community also today, Jason Marks. So hi, Jason, if you've been with us before, but we were talking about some of the alien examples, and he's like, hey, the Dominion was pretty much all xenophobic.
Yeah, absolutely.
About everybody, all solids. Even though it began as a reaction about they had been it's like the pendulum swinging back. The founders were xenophobic against solids because they had been abused. But it's like the double, it's like the abuser becomes the abused then. They had been hunted down and tried to be made extinct. So they're going to come back, they're going to roar back and wipe out everybody else. So which is not the healthiest outcome. But that, even though that was even though a crime was the basis of their xenophobia, that still doesn't make it right. I mean, makes sense.
Makes sense, and that's I think the Dominion is opening up the Halic frequencies just for a little bit, so we can kind of dive into some of these.
We had a really late start today, so hopefully we can get some time in. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about the Dominion is it is complicated, right, Larry? Like the changelings, the founders of the Dominion. They have a long. It's been a long road of discrimination that the founders have experienced, and it's part of that reason why they've become so isolationist, and have created this larger structure that is trying to protect them. They do cross a line, which I kind of wish we could revisit Odo and all the other founders and see how are they doing now, because I'd like to believe that Odo has helped them in some way to overcome their own xenophobia, and the Dominion is not it kind of parallels what we were talking about with Germany in World War II, right, Larry? That this group of people who really struggled in post-World War I economically suffered, were the exact people that were vulnerable to this totalitarian government that created these common enemies and engaged in the Holocaust, right? The founders, in some of the similar way,
Right.
were really struggling, were discriminated against, and became vulnerable to the very xenophobic beliefs that led them to create the Dominion and to subjugate the Gamma Quadrant, and then later try to invade the Alpha Quadrant. That this whole idea of, we're going to attack you before you have a chance to hurt us, because that's what you're going to do. You are going to hurt us.
Yeah, I mean, especially I feel like on Voyager, we're kind of overlooking it because I think a lot of the cases in Voyager, like the Devore there, was kind of the standout. But since Voyager was all about the planet of the week because we're still moving, it didn't sit in local space and occasionally find a new world because we think about the big governments. But yeah, that's all fodder for dramatic storytelling, sadly, as long as the good guys and heroes come out in the end, and sometimes that doesn't always happen. But yeah, as prejudice, stereotyping, xenophobia, racism are dramatic fodder. They're tools for telling a story. Hopefully the story points to a metaphor, an allegory, a good conclusion, a parable that makes us all feel better because at least a little bit of good was done somewhere in some corner of the universe somewhere. But it's not that it's not fodder for storytelling. Because it emotionally resonates with us because sadly it's not an alien concept. We all get it, and we can feel good or feel bad along the way, but feel good. So I mean, it's like you said, it's intersectional there on its
well, and
on its
this is,
impact and use.
This is where we mention IDIC often, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Chris says IDIC is a supremely valid outlook for our time and for all time, and I agree with that. And the thing about IDIC is it is very we need to always, I mentioned this before, constantly be vigilant for discrimination here. Libby is talking about pending legislation right now in Arkansas that is anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ laws that would really hurt, discriminate, persecute people who are trans and people who identify as LGBTQ plus. This is the thing about intersectionality and about IDIC. You can't pick and choose your fights here. We have to be for equity for all people, regardless of how they identify, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what they believe. And if we're not, Larry, we're not really doing the tough work of being IDIC, of working towards that future that we all love in Star Trek. Like we have to be for equity for all people. We can't pick and choose our fights here.
Yeah, I mean, Star Trek fans, just on a joking level, when I'd see two fans get in a fight about some trivia thing or something back in the day, and you kind of go, the ho guys, come on, IDIC. I'd say, are we going to come in? It's like, are you going to make me come in there and scream IDIC at you when people would be fighting over something like inconsequential but fun, and then you ramp that up to the big issues of the day, and it's like, do I have to come in there and scream IDIC at you? And that getting back the whole thing about, I see some so-called Star Trek fans spouting things, and I just want to go, I'm sorry, did you miss the whole part about the IDIC thing? But revving it up to last year, just recently I was trying to track this back, but when the post George Floyd, upheaval arose in reaction to that, and all the racial justice, the Black Lives Matter movement re-energized, and so many people across the board were involved, I saw emerging on some of the fans' channels, and just recently was trying to chase this back. The Women at Warp group, their podcast, and one of them was telling me Heather Barker was one, but wherever it started from, somebody came up with a IDIC means BLM, just as a simple statement, for the Star Trek community. And I was like, part of me was like, well, yeah. But it was like, oh, you know what? This needs to be said. It's like, hello, take your old thing that you're the not a rut, but the frame that you're so used to thinking. Now, here, look, it's 2020, it's 2021. Here's what that
Yeah.
means in real life. Here's what
Yeah.
that means.
And speaking of podcasts, Larry, I wanted to give a shout out to if anyone wants to learn more about Asian Americans and Star Trek. There's a great podcast called "All the Asians on Star Trek," where
Oh,
the
okay.
mission, hosted by Phil Yu, the mission of this podcast is to interview all the Asians that have appeared on Star Trek, and
It's,
it's really wonderful. The most recent episode interviewed Rosalind Chow from who portrayed Keiko on Star Trek: The Next Generation, Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. So if you're interested more about the Asian American community on Star Trek and probably
does,
Asian Canadian community as well, as Larry said, check
does
out All
his
the Asians on Star Trek.
does his podcast display a pro on camera bias?
It is all the actors. Yeah, it's all the actors on
Hmm.
Star Trek, not
Well,
necessarily.
there's an intersectional dynamic here. You could talk to behind the scenes. Why is
Um,
he discriminating against behind the scenes?
Actually, there's probably some of
I'm
the
t-
actors have also been behind the scenes. I'm guessing here.
well, okay,
Uh,
but I'm talking about anyway. The some of the folks I'm totally kidding, but anyway, and what's the name of that again? All the Asians on Star Trek.
all the Asians on Star Trek is the
Okay,
podcast.
maybe
Yeah,
I'll reach out
yeah.
to him and say, well, if you want some Asians on Star Trek that you never saw the face of, I can help
I
you
think
with.
that's a cool idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
I'll
think that
try
would be
that.
cool. He does
Uh,
these. He does these one-offs where he has people in the Asian American community talk about one of their favorite episodes of Star Trek. So I think there's definitely some room for. He calls those away missions. Slightly different than our away missions, but I think that would be a cool exploration to do some of the Asian Americans behind the scenes too. Um, Let's see, Larry. Any comments that we haven't gotten
I'm I'm
to? Oh, we
I'm
never. You know, we didn't mention it, Larry. I'm sorry we started late, folks. This was my fault again. I was running into not only parent delays, but parent delays because my daughter also has a cold, which also is making her irritable. It's not COVID-19, but it's just a cold, and she's more irritable as a result. So sorry, folks. We started late because of
you're
me.
forgiven.
Yeah,
That's why you
yeah.
wore that T-shirt. Like, don't hit
Yeah,
me.
I was like, please, be nice. Oh man, oh man.
No. Anyway, so yeah, so good show. Hi Johnny Beal. I'm really trying to keep up with the chat this week, guys and gals. Um, anyway, hopefully a good topic. Interesting. Um, yes, yes. We were sitting around trying to figure out what to do this week, and I had a couple of, and some of it was coming from this whole situation, but we didn't exactly what tack to take as far as. But this had come up before, and you said, well, let's just do Xenophobia
Yeah, I mean, one
from
of the
Terra
other things
Firma.
that
And finally, I said, wait, it's Terra Prime. But yes.
one of the things that I hope we can talk about in the future too is gun violence, and that's something that I know is
Mm.
for a global audience. You probably look at the mass shootings that happened in America, and you're like, what is wrong with
Well, talk
America?
about intersectionality. Part of this was not only was this guy did what he did, he was able to get the gun that he did it on the day that he did.
So that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about gun violence at some point. I know this is very naive to say, but for a very long time, I've believed that if we can have good non-lethal weapons, that's one way forward. So like weapons that do have like a stun capability. I think
Basically.
there's the problem with that is that viewpoint I think expresses a lot of ignorance of the culture of guns in America and
Well, that
all
was
of
that was
that.
what a taser was supposed to be, and you see taser abuse all the time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So it's a complicated issue, but I think that's another Larry, that's one piece of a lot of these tragic stories from the last year that we haven't yet tackled. So I hope hope we can tackle that in the near future. I think Star Trek has a lot to say about weapons. We see them from the get-go in the original series. Every away mission, someone's carrying a phaser. So I think we've got a lot we could say about weapons and gun violence and gun safety and all of that.
Yeah. In fact, I think I already know the K3 that I will do for that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That is
Thanks to Trek Files, and I'll leave it there. But yeah, hey, listen, I don't want to get away without. Yes,
Larry, one thing. We didn't mention the time change. One of our
bungled on that. Yeah,
European viewers saying, "Why are you all early this week?"
And I've already been through this with Tuesday Live and the Portales this week, and I bungled Tuesday. I got Wednesday right, and here I totally forgot to mention it again. Christoph, I'm sorry. You're doing your best to remind me, and yeah. So
yeah. Go ahead, Larry.
It'll be the same thing next week, too, which I really don't want anybody to miss, because next week is our 50th episode. So we have
a really fun episode planned for our 50th. It's going to be a fun thing. But yeah, folks, there's the United States does a stupid time change. And not the entire United States, actually, most of it. So we actually, our time changed by an hour. It went forward an hour.
Well, it's not. I think for one more, Europe's going to end it, but they change. Europe changes too. It's just that this year there's like always 1 week, and this year it'll be 2 weeks for us on Saturday. We're never together. If we all change together, that would be the other part of this. But we don't. There's always like a 1 or 2 week gap where we're like different on the fall and the spring both, and that's what really mucked us today. We changed and they didn't yet.
Yeah, and it's really annoying, Larry. I mean, God, you can't tell a 3-year-old that there's being a time change. It's been so disruptive to our sleep schedule this week, which hasn't helped. Hasn't helped with all the stuff going on this week. So yeah, I wish we could just get rid of that. It would be nice. Anyways, okay, Larry. Well, folks, we've had a wonderful time here with you this week, as we always do. We love our community. I always look forward to this time of the week. And Larry, where can people find more from Trekland this week?
Hey, well, LarryNemechek.com is always a good hub, and if you could throw that last K3 up there, just a reminder.
I just closed the window. Let me bring it back
up. Okay.
I'll bring it back up. Hold on, Larry.
No, I just want to say, hey guys, this is exciting. We're going to have our 50th episode here next week, and in about 10 days, I'm going to have just happened to work this way, the 200th episode, yes, 200, of Trekland Tuesdays Live, my Tuesday at 1 Pacific, 4 Eastern, 9 European, when we're doing it right. That'll be different next week. I just said that wrong. I'll have to change that. But whatever time it is, that Tuesday afternoon thing I do across the board, I think it's 1 p.m. Pacific, and it'll change. Anyway, we're coming up on show 200. I'll make sure to have the right times for everybody posted, just like we will do here next week. Anyway, I'm coming up on show 200, and right now at LarryNemechek.com, I'm having a special drawing. We're going to draw for two great books, the new DS9 guide and the Lost Scenes of Star Trek coffee table book from a couple years ago. I'm going to give those away live. Just go over and register for the drawing. I'm gonna do a you guessed the theme for Tuesdays, so that's going to come up there. Also, some other exciting things hopefully I can announce by then too. In much the same vein as we're going to have a very special show. Anyway, that's all the stuff. So Tuesdays Live on Tuesday. The Trek Files is still going on. My podcast, Roddenberry, at Larry Nemechek on Twitter. Wherever you're watching me right now, that's my YouTube. Please like and subscribe right now. Follow me on Facebook and all that. And then to say, Ollie, that we're going to have a very special episode here next week, assuming we get everybody here on the right times. It's our 50th, which is amazing to think. But all this talk about being in pandemic one year, that's where this all arose from. This was a panel that was canceled at WonderCon. And speaking of WonderCon, we have a panel again at WonderCon that you will actually see, which is this show in a short form, and that's going to be next Friday at. Oh my God, I forgot to finalize this, and I'm just rambling.
We'll share it.
Yeah, we'll share this, guys. I've been trying to. Let me know. I'm going to put a post on the Facebook page. What Facebook page? Please go like and join our Facebook page for life support. I'm going to put a post up. Is there any interest in having a live chat going while our pre-recorded panel is happening at 4 p.m. Pacific on Friday? If you're interested in that, we will come up with the platform and publicize that.
And folks, with that,
for scattered, but guys, yeah. How about you, Ollie? Are we there?
I'm just trying to survive and get through. It's been busy, but we're looking forward to our 50th. Folks, we'd love to see you on our Life Support Live Discord community. I think Scott already shared a link to that in the comments. Thank you for doing that, Scott. Thank you again to Scott for editing our episodes for the podcast. Our hope and goal is to get all the episodes up on our podcast feed by our 50th episode, which will be next week. So we're hoping to make that happen. So thank you, Scott, for helping out with that. And then thank you to Scott and Jared also for moderating and keeping this a safe place for all of us. Folks, we will see you in 1 week for our 50th episode. And until then, live long and prosper, everyone.
Pay attention to the page. Lots of stuff's happening. Trek well, everybody.